just the ability to innovate a new material and to think what's possible. I think that's where the work is. And that's where I see, my work continuing, figuring out what's possible with these materials. Future is bright.
Welcome to the Biochar Show, where we examine biochar as a highly configurable carbon material system engineered for resilience, durability, and scale across the agriculture, industry, and the built environment. I'm your host, John Webster of GoBiochar.com. And on today's episode, it sits at a critical intersection where we explore biochar beyond soil amendment and into a broader conversation about biochar carbon as a design material, a systems input, and a pathway to decarbonizing entire value chains. Our guest is Bill Hilgendorf, who is working at the convergence of production, education, and advanced materials. Bill operates across three domains: on-the-ground implementation through White Feather Farm, regional production through New York Carbon, and forward-looking material innovation through Eco Building Systems. His background in industrial design brings a different lens to this work, one that treats biochar not just as a byproduct, but as a highly configurable carbon platform. In this conversation, we move through the full stack, from flame cap systems and mid-scale production realities to grant-funded education networks to the economics of biochar, and ultimately into the emerging role of biochar carbon in insulation, filtration, and next generation materials. I know you're going to enjoy this episode as much as I did recording it. Bill, thank you for joining us today. Really looking forward to a fantastic conversation. Let's go ahead and have you explain kind of a little bit of your background, but introduce yourself, please.
Yeah. So, Bill Hilgendorf. And Bill Hilgendorf. So my work with biochar really is in three parts. I have one part is my education and research work, and that's through a nonprofit, White Feather Farm, where I spend most of my days, where I am right now. And then I also do some biochar, sort of run a medium scale biochar production facility called New York Carbon. And that is a partnership with the owner of the farm and the third generation lumber mill that's right next door adjacent to the farm. And the third thing is a startup that I'm working on, which is Eco Building Systems. And that is a biochar enhanced material company. So our goal with that is to decarbonize the built environment through rethinking and engineering new materials with biochar.
Well, that's really cool. So, and I know that you have and have had an extensive design background.
Yeah,
So, and I
it's
believe it was
interesting.
with furniture.
Yeah, furniture. I studied industrial design and then started a furniture design and manufacturing company out of Brooklyn, New York, and ran that for 20 years. And I think what's interesting, a little bit interesting about my approach to biochar is through that design thinking perspective and through the built environment. My furniture company, we focused a lot on using recycled materials and finding materials and products at the end of their lifespan, and then through a design process or a manufacturing process, breathing new life into them, but also not forgetting where they came from, but telling the story of those materials, often through the design, the collections of furniture that we did. So one of our most well-known collections was the Coney Island collection. So after Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, it tore up a lot of parts of the iconic boardwalk down in Coney Island, and they were just dumpstering big portions of that. And it was this beautiful ipe material out of South America that was on the boardwalk for over 60 years. And this was when that material was first started to be imported. And it wasn't the sort of what we think of as the common ipe of today, which is this sort of monotone brown, but it was actually a collection of over 20 different species of South American hardwoods. And so when we found that material, as we started to work, mill it down, all these colors came out. And so we built a collection around that, highlighting some of the iconic landmark structures of Coney Island. So telling the story of that material through the new designs. And really the path of that through to biochar is interesting because I think through my whole education and early work as an entrepreneur and designer, I was very much obsessed with this idea of upcycling. So finding materials, and New York City was the best place for that because space is such a premium. People throw out perfectly good things all the time. So there was
Hmm.
always, you know, incredible inspirational things, from dumpsters full of giant columns of yellow heart pine, which is now pretty much extinct, coming out of buildings, other pieces of furniture. Just inspiration was everywhere. So I also did a lot of work. I always was interested in this idea of shoshugiban, the Japanese finishing technique for siding, which is charred cedar. And so I did a lot of work with wood. I did a lot of work with charring wood. And then in 2019, I did a trip to Gothenburg, Sweden with a friend of mine who was writing an article for GQ because Gothenburg claimed to be the most sustainable city in the world at that point. So we had 30 meetings in 5 days with everyone from manufacturing to food services to transportation to power, and just seeing all the things that they were doing to make the city more and more sustainable. And through that, I met with these two really cool guys who had taken over one of the abandoned docks in the harbor in Gothenburg and were growing. They had a whole CSA that they had set up in these raised beds and hoop houses on this abandoned dock. And for a couple of years, had gathered a group of over 100 people who were getting their vegetables from this urban farm, and they were utilizing biochar. They were making their own compost. They were getting biochar. They were working into the compost, and that was the first time I had heard about biochar. And that really, like, sort of a light went off. Although, I have no background in soil or agriculture, so it wasn't really something that stuck with me as a potential career until I came back to New York, and it was early 2020. I was meeting with a friend of mine and his friend, who's a material scientist, and he told me again about biochar. He had done some work when he was a graduate student helping farmers in India, instead of burning their crop waste, to pyrolyze it and make. For that, it was more of like a smokeless cooking material. So the ability, because so many people still cook on open fires around the world, to have a smokeless cooking fuel was a way to help support health initiatives. But for him, from his material science background, was like, there's so much more that we could do with this material. We were basically just reducing it to carbon. And, if you introduce different binders, you can create a whole category of materials with the carbon as a base. And so that was when, the light really went off for me. And I had already been sort of discouraged with the direction my company was going, with investors and this sort of need to grow and grow. And we had pivoted to office furniture and really lost our roots as a narrative design company focusing on sustainability. So I took that opportunity to step back from running it and just focus on biochar. And that was in 2020. So for the last 6 years now, I've only focused on research and work around biochar.
That's the rabbit hole, right?
Yeah.
You get in there, you get the introductions. At first, you're like, I'm not sure what this is, and this is highly configurable carbon. Let's
Yeah,
see what we can do with it, right?
totally.
So I guess your transition from design, how did you end up at the farm?
Yeah. So, I think, as you said, I started going down that rabbit hole. And at this point, even though my interest was still focused around materials, a lot of the economy and work in biochar was in soil and agriculture. So, actually, through a very sort of random connection, I found out that just a half mile through the woods from my house was this mill that had this large biochar a production machine, the carbonator, which I think at that point there was only maybe 14 of them in the country. And obviously there's other technologies, but that seemed like more than just a coincidence to find this
Yeah.
good scale production. So at that point, I just offered my services. I had, was still on payroll for my furniture company. So I had some flexibility in my work. And so I just volunteered and helped learn how to run the machine and just tried to learn everything I could about biochar, not only its uses, but its production, the different feedstocks you could use, the different methods. Really, at that point, I was just being a sponge and trying to soak up any possible
Yeah.
information I could. And it was right there. So I just, for a couple of months, I worked running that machine, helping running that machine, figuring out because they had just gotten it at the time and just figuring out how to optimize it and how to make the most biochar that we could.
Yeah, and is that I know it's a Tiger Cat. Is that the 60/40 carbonator or
No, it's
the
actually the
60/50?
60/50. It's the first ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was right shortly after Tiger Cat acquired ROI, which was the original manufacturer of it, and so we worked a lot directly with Matt O'Connor, who was the designer of it,
Mhm.
figuring out how to best use it in our situation, which was milling, mostly using the milling offcuts from the sawmill, but then also in our area, the transfer stations were so overloaded with green waste coming out of the area that they stopped accepting it. So the mill, because they were set up to process that material, they would accept local green waste from homeowners and tree services. So that combined with the mill offcuts was our feedstock, which is primarily eastern white pine that we were running in the machine.
Yeah. So when they take that green waste, are they getting a tipping fee?
Yeah, they do get a tipping fee. Yep.
Okay.
So
That
that
really
is
helps with the
definitely part of
economics.
the business
Yeah.
model. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
you can't.
So yeah, and so from my work with that, I was introduced to the farm manager here at White Feather, and they had been really interested. It was always a partnership between the ownership of the farm and the owners of the lumber mill, and they had been wanting to incorporate more biochar into the soil at the farm. And because at that point I had been 2 years deep into biochar, they hired me at first as a consultant to work on doing some just sort of basic research and integration of biochar and then more of as a full-time role as we took on some more grants and became part of the American Farmland Trust national trial breaking down barriers to biochar adoption. And so yeah, that's how I became began to work with the farm.
A supporting sponsor of this program is Future Fresh Farms and their micro-revived biological product line. Biochar provides the carbon. Biology unlocks the potential. Microrevive introduces beneficial microbes designed to work alongside biochar, helping support nutrient retention, root growth, and resilient living soils, suitable for direct-to-soil, foliar, and controlled environment applications. Microrevive is OMRI certified and registered for agricultural use in all states. Microrevive, regenerating soils to feed the future. Learn more at futurefreshfarms.com. The biochar industry is growing fast. Connect with the people, projects, technologies, and ideas shaping its future at the North American Biochar Conference. Learn more, register, or become a sponsor at biocharconference.com. Okay, so when I hear American Farmland Trust, I immediately start to think research and education.
Yeah.
So is that kind of what you've been doing with? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a lot of my work. And I think, anyone who's started in biochar, I think in the last 10 years, you've seen that progression. When I first started talking about it, I would tell my friends, hey, I'm working with biochar. And they'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about. But in the last, 5, 6 years, now there's sort of this critical mass of people who have heard of it. Maybe they don't know exactly what it does, they haven't used it, but at least they know some basics. So in that interim, though, a lot of my work was about education and spreading the word and getting people sort of a basic understanding of it. So at the farm, we did a lot of community engagement and events and stuff. So that was when I started working. I sort of moved from that larger production scale to the flame cap kiln scale, where I could do these demonstrations with a sort of a smaller version of the ring of fire. I use it. It's called the char cone. It's a sort of Weber-sized grill version of a Kontiki, and it's a great educational model because I can do a burn in about 2 hours. It can be very hands-on. And it really helps people to understand the process. It's a great way to talk about. I've always been someone who likes to work hands on, not so
Hmm.
much behind a computer. And of course, coming out of the pandemic, just to be able to get back together in person, I wanted to
Yeah.
take advantage of that. So, yeah, so a lot of those sort of small demos, I've done it with high school students, at garden clubs, with a lot of farmers. And then that sort of developed into the major grant that I'm working on, which is a 3-year grant with Northeast SARE, which is Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education. And that's a USDA funded grant. And that is the Biochar Learning Network is the name of that grant. And so with that, I'm working with 5 other nonprofit farms and organizations in the Hudson Valley here in New York to focus on helping them. These are all organizations that also have their own sort of educational programming. So the idea is sort of the teach the teachers program where I am providing kilns for each of these farms and then helping them learn how to run them. And then with the idea of after 2 years, a couple of demonstrations, they will be running their own kilns on farm, creating their own biochar, their own closed circular systems.
That's fantastic. So do you have open burns there where you are in the Hudson Valley?
We do. They do allow open burns. We're in the middle of a burn ban currently. Every
Hmm.
March through May, they have a burn ban. But a lot of the work too that I do, some of the education is with local communities, is trying to teach because everyone around here, we live in a pretty rural area. They have a pretty big pile of sticks at the end of the winter when they do their lawn cleanup. And yeah, the
Yeah.
most people, yeah, just want to burn that pile. So I try to, one of my goals for my demonstrations is to at least let people know that there are ways to take this material and instead of just burning it down to ash, you can actually create a quite valuable material that can sequester carbon and be used for building soil. A lot of people have their own gardens or even just their own plantings around their properties. So it's a pretty easy sell, but
Yeah.
it's great to
Yeah.
have an open audience and to be able to explain there are other options than just burning.
Well, one of the things about the just burning concept, especially when you're doing the bush clearing, is that you get all that smoke. And
Right.
the residents, you get used to it, but it doesn't mean you enjoy it. So when
Yeah.
you're teaching these flame cap processes, whether it's with the tiger cat doing its form of thermal decomposition into the biochar,
Mhm.
or the ring of fire and the modified Kontiki design that you're working with, when you teach them that there's the better way with benefit plus the knock-on benefit
Right.
of less air pollution, it tends to set off some bells for folks. In fact, that ring of fire is now being sold throughout North America and even in some other markets by Tartar USA. And the messaging they have behind it is to reduce your land-based materials.
Yeah.
Use it as a clean way to do it. It contains it. It's a
Right.
burn in a bin. It makes it really safe, less fugitive embers. I do want to take a minute to pitch the fact that Biochar on Site is a group of working practitioners that utilize flame cap processes. And on that at biocharonsite.org, if you go to resources, there are 2 fact sheets. One is on the biochar burn piles. So it's biochar conservation burn pile. It tells you how to use simple techniques. The Boy Scouts and other groups told us burn from the bottom. Now we know if you burn from the top, you're
Yes.
processing those gases and reducing the amount of pollution. So there's a fact sheet on that, as well as the fact sheet on the Ring of Fire kiln and the use of that. Well, actually, it's not on the Ring of Fire. It's on flame cap systems in general, and it's a great education material.
Yeah.
So and they have a month, and Bill's been coming to this as well. We have a monthly meeting for Biochar on Site the first Wednesday of each month at noon Pacific. One of the things I do want to point out is that Bill is on a working farm. He's inside the greenhouse, and we've got some little
We
friends, the
do have
birds in
some
the
little friends
background.
here. Yeah,
So,
I know they just showed up.
and we love that, right? It's the connection between the two. I do kind of want to bounce back to the
Yeah,
AFT and
totally.
your
Well, I just want to say I
NE
just
SARE.
purchased 3 kilns from Tartar. I haven't set them up, but for
Ah,
my grant, 3 of the farms that I'm working with will get a Ring of Fire kilns for their on-site use. So full circle there. I'm coming around.
that really is. So when you're doing that, have you tried doing the 8-panel setup where you had a couple extra
I
panels
haven't yet.
to
No,
do
this
a
is
little more?
I only have my original a ring of fire kiln, which I've run a lot of times on its own. I haven't set up the multiple together yet. So we'll see. That'll be a good opportunity this spring.
Yeah, yeah. And for folks that aren't aware, the Ring of Fire will do, and similar will do, you can process quite a bit of waste, but it's not significant tonnage. Whereas that Tiger Cat carbonator, they were originally designed to be combustion systems to reduce the biomass.
Yeah.
And now they have the output with biochar, so that way they're doing both the larger reduction of biomass with some carbon output. So it's really a way to take a very useful tool and add additional benefit out the back end.
Yep.
And in the industry, we address the things like the Tiger Cat as the mid tech, whereas, uh, the flame cap kilns are kind of that entry level.
Right. Yeah, no,
So
the Tiger Cat can process up to 15 tons per hour. So it really does process a lot. The
yeah,
yield
that's
is
significant.
not ideal, and I can speak more
Yeah.
to sort of
Yeah, I think
the,
it's
but it is like, and then that's the reason I think that they got it originally was really just its ability to process a lot of material quite quickly.
the
Yeah.
reductions. Yeah. And so they were using that for both the green waste and their own needs,
Yes.
their own
Yeah.
offcuts. Okay. So yeah, so super practical. Plus they get the tipping fee, so they have a whole business model.
Yeah.
But I did get distracted a little bit from the grants,
Oh
the
yeah.
Northeast SARE and the American Farmland Trust.
Yeah. So the Northeast Air grant, like I said, it's a 3-year grant. And at the end, I will do a booklet and a little website about the learnings, trying to basically help encourage that on-site biochar production. Because every time we make biochar, we move it somewhere else, sort of decreasing that benefit of the carbon sequestration by creating new emissions. So ideally, just from a logistics standpoint, to be able to make and process all your own material on land is the ideal scenario, and then work that right back into the soil. So that's the main part of that grant. And then the American Farmland Trust, that is really an interesting program. We linked up with AFT early on when we did a fundraiser here at the farm for they were fundraising for small farms, helping small farms raise money to expand for machinery in New York State. That was when we found out about the national trial and got involved in that. And it's been a good program for us. We hosted a field day last year with about 50 people, local farmers, service providers, and biochar enthusiasts alike. And really, for that, focused on our trial is quite small compared to a lot of the other trials in New York State, particularly. The ones in New York State are more like 5 to 20 acres, I believe, the trial areas, where we're, just 4 60-foot beds because we're a market farm. So we don't have large scale trials. But what's interesting about the trial is it's coast to coast. So I think there's 12 states that are involved in it. So in New York,
Yeah.
they're focusing on soy and corn production on a larger scale. But right next door in Massachusetts, they're doing a mixed vegetable trials. So even though we're in New York State, we're actually closer to some of the Western Mass trials. And more similar, we're also doing a mixed vegetable trial. So it's really cool. It's a 5-year trial. So we're collecting data. We have 1 year of data so far, but we're collecting data for all 5 years. And we did extensive soil testing beforehand, not only in the trial beds, but also in other parts of the farm. We had this really cool company called Earth Optics come around, and they have a proprietary scanner that measures soil carbon throughout big swaths of the property, and they'll come back in 5 years and see sort of how our various interventions may have affected that, hopefully positively. So it's nice to be part of a large national trial, and American Farmland Trust just does such amazing work trying to support farmers, education around it. I mean, and with any new technology, I say new because we all know that the reason we're using biochar is from Terra Preta, 2 to 3 thousand years ago, still showing positive results. But there's, a lot of education. Farmers, it's a risk when you try and do something new. And we need these on farm multi year trials to just sort of de risk that for your average farmer, show them this stuff works.
Yeah, the education's difficult, even though this is ancient Earth wisdom, right? As long as there's been spark, biomass, and
Yeah.
oxygen, we've had natural carbon occurring. And now we're bringing this to market on the industrial side, the commercial side. The education is a little difficult. I know that it's daunting. So when we have groups like American Farmland Trust behind it, that really builds the credibility. In my own personal experience, I know that the new kid on the block always gets the blame.
Mm,
So if they're trying biochar and something doesn't quite go
yeah.
right, blame the
Right.
biochar because they're commonly used to different processes, frankly, heavy on the chemicals, feed the root, not the
Mm.
soil. I'll stay off that soapbox, but I am glad that we do have that new transition from chemical only to soil
Yes.
building practices with natural solutions. So, in terms of the Northeast SARE and AFT, can you tell us about the grant application process? How difficult
Yeah,
was it?
that it is like, I mean, um, I guess I have to say we were fortunate at the time to have the resources to be able to hire a grant writer to help us with that process. I directed and guided the sort of project and what made sense. I thought what made sense for us to do. But it does, that it's very tedious. I mean, we just had to renew because it's a USDA grant. We just had to renew our SAM registration, which is any government grant, you have to have this registration. And it's almost like they make it hard to discourage you from doing it. So you really just got to stick with it. If you can find
Persistence.
persistence, and if you can find someone who has experience navigating that side of the government grants, they're definitely still out there. I mean, in this administration and climate, they're a little bit harder to find, but they're still there. We even had a couple, or at least one 336 NRCS 336 program that we got in the ground this past month, which was actually my first one that has successfully happened. So it's still possible. I think it's a little bit more, you got to be on top of it a little bit more, but it's still out there. So it's good to see.
Yeah. Well, I am encouraged because we had Kristen Tripp from USDA ARS on a previous episode. She runs the Biochar Atlas, and she's the one who told us that the Code 336 funding was still in full
Yeah.
swing. So, but I do know that it has been difficult to find NRCS agents that are familiar with it because, again, they have these big books of responsibilities and very, very little support, which is another reason why they have this program called TSP, Technical Service Providers. And I want to encourage anybody that's out there that's familiar in this field, please apply to become a TSP. Consider getting your biochar certification. It's a great way to help restore carbon to our soils. All right. Well, it sounds like that wasn't too bad. It wasn't too easy, but it wasn't too bad. I know that the American Biochar Institute has some documentation on how to work with the NRCS, but let's talk about more about the business side with the
Yeah.
NY Carbon and what that transition part is and your responsibilities.
Yeah, totally. New York Carbon is really, like, although it's been around for a couple of years, this past year that I've been focused solely on doing business development and sales and product. We've really actually is the first year we started to move some products. It's quite, I mean, the industry right now is at an interesting moment because there's a lot more production coming online. And there's a lot of downward pressure on pricing, which, makes sense. If I wish I could supply every farmer who came to me and wanted biochar with it for free or at a very low cost. But in the end, it's quite expensive to produce. I mean, if it, you know, takes us 10 tons of material to make 1 ton of biochar, you're talking about moving around and processing a lot of material. So I think, what's interesting is there's still enough support, I think, from various philanthropic programs and grant funding that we can subsidize it somewhat to get the biochar in the ground. But I do get a little bit nervous about our ability to really produce at scale in a sustainable business model. I think especially since a lot of you were seeing some of the carbon credit, the big supporters of that, like Microsoft, pull back a little bit with some of their CDR purchases. I think that in the long term, that will be a necessary way to grow the industry. But right now, I think we have to look to some other ways to keep, being able to produce material and get it into the ground or into other
Yeah, in
things.
terms of that, yeah, that downward pressure. I know that there are a lot of producers out there that rely on those carbon
Yeah.
credits to offset the market price. So, because like you and I, a lot of us get into this for the altruistic reasons, but then we come to that stark realization that that doesn't pay the
Yeah.
mortgage, that doesn't move the market in any
Yeah.
way. And one of the things that I'm really encouraged about, even though we're seeing this downward pressure on price, is that we see a predictable supply chain for carbon to these industries, in particular to
Hmm.
ag. And now folks that are ag suppliers are saying, oh, I can start building biochar into my
Right.
product lines, not necessarily selling it as biochar, but selling it as a
Yeah.
carbon enhancement because they do it at a small fraction. But a small fraction on a large
Right.
product line is a lot of
Yes.
biochar.
Yeah, no, and I
So,
think it's funny because it kind of, although I've spent the bulk of my time the last 5 years, like learning and working with soil and ag and farming, my original passion is still back there in thinking how this carbon could go into advanced materials. And I think you're starting to see, as some of these carbon credit business models look a little less stable, producers are more interested in exploring how they can get that carbon into other products and develop those other markets. And so I think, it's like anything, one door closes, another one opens. And I think, the growth and the production of biochar is unstoppable in a lot of ways. I think it's happening, but I think some of these, especially larger scale producers, are going to have to start rethinking about exactly where their material goes. And I think offtake agreements and offtake commitments have always been sort of one of the weaker links in the model. And now I think, though, for me, I'm excited because I've been talking to a lot of regional producers, from Maine down to Pennsylvania in the Northeast, who are saying, hey, we can't sell biochar for $100 a yard. It doesn't make sense, or less than that. What else, are the options out there? And then we start getting into really interesting products like structural soils and stormwater remediation, talking about filtration and these other post processing. So what I've really come to sort of learn about biochar, and I think this is where it's maybe a little different just with my design background, sort of an approach to it. But, seeing now, I've sort of realized that you have these sort of three categories of this biocarbon. So you have biochar, which is sort of the lowest on the totem pole of, you can make it very easily. You can dig a hole, you can make biochar a hole, you can use a low tech kiln to make it. And then you have biocarbon, which is a sort of more controlled process. So think of like what you can do with a pyreg or some of these more advanced technologies where you're really able to control that temperature, residence time, particle size, everything. And then you get into the sort of third category, which is like a hard carbon, where you're taking that biocarbon and you're really reducing it to a very compact, similar structured material. And each of these things has its own use and its own pathway, but you start getting into, as you control the process more and you really make for a concise, consistent material, then you start to open up these other pathways, in advanced materials, in battery technology, in all these new places that we really just haven't explored yet. And that's what gets me the most excited about working with the material.
yeah, well, I like to say highly
Yes.
configurable. So when people say, "So tell me about biochar, does it do this?" And instead of that hum and haw of
Yeah.
it depends, I say the good news is that biochar is
Yeah.
highly configurable. So based on what your desired outcome is, we can
Yeah.
craft it for you. We can build it and make
Yeah.
it repeatable.
Totally.
So again, and you're right with the built environment opportunities on the very near term and becoming reality. I mean, we have a lot of above ground
Yeah.
biomass and quote unquote waste materials that need they need to be we need
Yeah.
to be able to handle them, and with especially the way you think with the circularity, the way more and more the corporate side is thinking about circularity and their objectives and decarbonizing their supply chains. Like you said, I think it's unavoidable at this point.
Yeah.
Actually, I know it's unavoidable. That's why so many people are committed to it. And back to your offtake agreements to get funding on
Yeah.
the commercial side, you're very lucky. You were fortunate. You were not that far from somebody that had already made this,
Right.
what, like $1 million
Yeah.
investment in a carbonator. And when you think about the commercial systems you were talking about, you're usually at the very low end, about a
Yeah.
million and a half and then the Pyregs and some of the others, 3 million,
Yeah.
5 million. By the time you get everything done on your plant, you're looking anywhere between 3 and
Yeah.
10 million. And that's for something that's considered even
Right.
smaller scale on the industrial side. The big ones, you're looking at
Yeah.
$50
Yeah.
million. Or if you're doing a multi-node install, 25 to
Yeah.
100 million. But it becomes configurable in those markets that you identified with filtration. They tend to be a little less
Right.
price sensitive because most of them are backed through municipal
Hmm.
contracts. And so and they're looking at it from what's the benefit
Right.
to our taxpayer. So if there's durable benefit to it, they can justify the
Yeah.
cost. But yeah, the price per ton is dramatically different than it used to be when I first, around the same
Yeah.
time that you got into it. When I first started selling biochar, it was
Right.
$500 a yard. And now, with the brokering that I do, I can find it for 500 to
Right.
700 a ton. So, but again, that tends to need to go into
Yeah.
sequestration, right? Because you talked about the biocarbon and the biofuel gets burned up and
Yeah.
there's no credit for that, but the sequestration side, that's what allows them
Yeah.
to get in there. Let's go ahead and talk a bit more about your
Yeah.
startup,
Yeah.
Echo.
So, Echo Building Systems is a partnership between myself, Aaron Ruby, and again Arthur Jogfilmeth. Um, we started out with the idea of wanting to build a carbon, like a net zero home kit. So thinking about all the materials that go into a small ADU or cabin, sort of a workforce housing, small scale, not necessarily apartment, multifamily buildings. But what we quickly identified was, after concrete and steel, the biggest carbon emitter footprint of a building is the insulation. And we just sort of identified this opportunity to start to think about how do we decarbonize a high performance installation. So something that's really scalable, something that can really have a big impact. So we identified that closed cell polyurethane foam is one of the best performers, but it also carries a pretty high footprint. So we started there. We've been identifying right now, we're about 60 to 65% bio-based with a goal to make a 100% bio-based thermal insulation foam. But we already had a good starting point. We knew that companies like BASF had worked with graphite to enhance the thermal value of insulation foam. And so our thesis was, can we do the same thing with biochar? And so after extensive testing, found a material and a process that gives us about a 10 to 25% bump in R value per inch with using a
Wow.
10% loading of biochar. So it's exciting. It's a long process. Building materials are certainly not a quick
Hmm.
turnaround. We have some other products in the pipeline that we're working on, but right now the thermal insulation has been our main focus. We did receive a grant to work on that through Columbia University and NYSERDA, which is a New York-based fund supporting energy development. And so that's what's paid for our testing. And we're in the process of doing the fundraising now, but so far we've been able to do everything just with grant funding. But it's exciting because I think what we figured out, sort of our specialty, is going to be to help some of these larger producers figure out sort of what the material that they have based on their process and feedstock, what characteristics it has, and what other markets, even if they're not developed yet, that might be able to go into. And so we're sort of finding ourselves in this niche where I'm sort of helping producers functionalize the material that they're making through their process, which might involve a post-processing, micronization or like a activation through, increasing the surface area, all these different post-processing possibilities, but still taking that material in their process and being able to, you know, push it into new markets and new opportunities for different products from the same sources. So I think that's exciting. It feels like maybe that's not something that has a lot of work has been done or a lot of people have been thinking about. So I think there's an opportunity there to sort of help, keep driving the industry through some other areas that have yet to be kind of figured out. But yeah, we'll see where that takes us.
Yeah, I'd have to say I believe that to be a pioneering
Yeah.
business case. So let's figure out how to get it in. I've I've just been dedicated to the soil side. Let's get it in
Yeah.
there. Although recently, from the brokerage standpoint, I've been working with producers that are having to sell it
Yeah.
as
Oh, wow.
fuel and get it pelletized, just like you're
Yeah.
talking about with the post production. Well, if you need to keep the lights on for a while, sell
Yeah.
some of it as fuel. And if they're willing to pay the difference with what the carbon credit would have generated,
Yeah.
it
It
still
is. Yeah. I
decarbonizes heavy
think
industry.
anytime we're able to
That's
swap
a big
out a
deal.
fossil fuel input for a biofuel input, we're making progress. Now, we're not going to solve everything
Yeah.
tomorrow. We need to take incremental steps. And sometimes just changing habits and changing sources is a step
Yeah,
forward.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Keep that fossil carbon in the ground and
Yeah.
work with what we have. Yeah, the let's see here. I'm just wondering, what do you see as kind of the next pathway for biochar?
Yeah.
Feels like you're already
Well, I
there,
mean, I think
right?
like,
With the
this is
with
sort of
Echo.
something I certainly realize and imagine a lot. I know you realize a lot of people in this space. Like, I think, it is important to work in sort of all sides of the biochar marketplace and understand everything, from soil to materials to even potentially fuel for decarbonizing, metallurgy and, those different opportunities, just to see how we can get the infrastructure in place because I think we do need to scale this. It is an inherently um, most beneficial when it's regional. We can't be shipping this material all over the world or even all over the country. We need to figure out, standards and, what we're talking about as we develop the market, develop the different materials because it's not one material. It's a category of materials. And the sort of
Yeah,
faster we can settle on, agree on different definitions of what is what, I think the easier it'll be to grow the market and to grow into some of these new areas. Because I think right now it still sometimes feels a little Wild West. You have people, saying they're selling something, but people don't know enough to know the difference between a high carbon fly ash and a, you know, really high carbon, woody biomass based biochar. So I think,
right.
it's
Yeah,
early. Even though I know people have been working for 30 years in this area, it still
yeah,
feels like early days in a lot of ways. And I think just keeping, things moving. And, I think much like, someone recently compared it to the beginnings of the oil and gas industry, like when we first started pumping oil out of the
hmm,
ground, we had two products and we didn't even know how to refine it, and I feel in some ways like biochar and biocarbon is the same in a similar place where we're really just at the beginning of understanding what the possible product paths are. And if you think of, what has happened with oil, and the categories of products, now we're realizing how awful some of them are. But the microplastics and all of that, but just the ability to innovate a new material and to think what's possible. I think that's where the work is, and that's where I see my work continuing, figuring out what's possible with these materials. Future is bright.
future's
Yeah.
bright. Yeah, there's a little there's I know these are the things that make me feel the optimism. They're the things that keep me going on a day-to-day basis is how do we,
Yeah.
we can win.
It's gonna be, yeah,
It's going to be
a lot of
work.
work.
It's a lot of work. I mean, I mean, I've literally broken bones like working in biochar. So,
Yeah,
but I'm still here. And I know that other people are doing the same thing, you know. There are folks that have lost their houses but the thing that I am finding fantastic is that we do have these markets that are building. We do have banks that are willing to lend. We have
yeah,
investors that are coming in that are willing to have the slow returns. So instead of expecting that
yeah,
.com type turnaround, they're looking at, they're
right.
fine with a 5-year
Yeah.
turnaround, but those offtakes are
No,
still,
yeah.
that's the
No,
unicorns
and
inside
it's
of
a
the offtakes.
challenging time, with not just the political wins that are happening now, but also just the amount of investment, the percentage of investment going into AI and not into hard science. I mean, yeah, it's
Hmm.
tough times, but like again, these are our cycles that happen, and there's such a good community, I feel like, in the biochar space, and people really committed, that I have no doubt that we'll be able to weather this storm and figure out the next thing for it. So yeah,
Yeah. So real quick, here's a question. When you're at a party, when you tell people you work with biochar,
what's my
what's your
elevator pitch?
elevator pitch? Yeah, what's your elevator pitch? How do you
Yeah, I
explain
think
it?
like I like to go from the upcycling, because I think that's something that people can understand. I think this sort of goal of taking waste materials, everyone at this point pretty much understands that we can't just keep throwing things away infinitely, and that there is a cost to everything that we consume. And so this idea of being able to utilize waste material, and through a process that not only sequesters carbon, so helps reduce, slow down, basically buys us, I talk about it as buying us more time to figure out, how to scale this stuff. But, basically, being able to utilize this material that we see as waste, and some of it is highly problematic, when you think about um contaminated materials that we can figure out how to use again, how to destroy PFAS, microplastics, um, capture heavy metals. I mean, I think a lot of those benefits go into this, but this basic idea of being able to take waste and turn it into a valuable product and help sequester carbon at the same time. That's usually sort of my short of it, but it's easy to get long-winded. So maybe that wasn't concise enough. I don't know.
No, I think we all have that same problem,
Yeah.
It's so cool and it's like go look it up
Yeah.
and enjoy the rabbit hole because you're gonna learn about it and then you're gonna also want to become a carbon hero. You're gonna
Yeah.
be thinking about how to use it in the lawns, getting your cities to use it and learning more about tree maintenance and tree
Yeah.
planting with biochar and how it can save money and just the fact that, I often, I know I said this a lot of times, but when I do events, like the education events that you're talking about, and there's a kid that
Yeah.
comes up to the booth, I'm like, hey, have you thought about soil science and biochar? Because you get to
Yeah.
burn stuff and get your hands in the
Yeah.
dirt, right? Like and it's great. Everybody's always
Yeah.
happy or
No,
happy-ish. You're
one of
involved in
my
that
favorite
healing.
demos is my kids' school that they used to go to, Woodstock Day School here just around the corner. They have an intensives program where they send me, 10 high school students. And yeah, we burn set fire to a bunch of wood and then make biochar, and they get to see the whole process. And then at the end, they take it back and they put it in their garden, mix it with the compost. So it really is a nice way for them to see. And then I can, also do a little education about greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, and show some charts. And it really helps to explain it. It can be very, um, sometimes it's hard to get your head around, these concepts. And it's a really nice way to make it, I think, just palatable, especially for younger people who, all this stuff is going to
Yeah,
be more effect, have more effect on them than
it's
us old guys.
yeah. Well, and it's going to be a necessity as well. And you were talking earlier about standards and definitions, and that's one of the things that I'm so encouraged about with the American
Yep.
Biochar Institute. They're making that transition from the old USBI, so it's no longer an
Yeah.
initiative, it's an institute. No, I personally know that they're working on well over 20, I think some
Oh,
30
wow.
odd BMPs. So how to use it in filtration. I think there's a big
Yep.
stormwater BMP that's going to be released here shortly, and I think that's going to be well, I know that's going to be ground changing. And we see cities and states that are adopting biochar practices. We have groups like the SLA and others that are interested in putting it into their practices. You know, I do want to touch on the fact that with ABI, are you going to be at the North American Biochar
Oh yeah,
Conference in New
I
Orleans
definitely
this fall?
definitely
Do
plan
you
on
think
it.
you'll make
Yeah,
it?
I wouldn't miss it. Those are
Yeah,
always great gathering,
yeah,
lots of idea sharing. It's a wonderful time.
yeah,
Yeah. Oh yeah, I
yeah.
shouldn't want to
Do you think you're going to
don't
have a
yeah,
booth?
not forget my yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
so this is,
yeah,
we were talking earlier about how we go from
yeah,
enthusiast to industry. So we both had these plates for a while. You and I first met at the 2020 International Biochar
yeah,
Initiative
yeah. In
Academy,
Helsingborg, no, in
Biochar
Helsingborg,
Academy
Sweden
in
was when we
upstate New
first
York.
met. Yeah, yeah,
That was our first
yeah. When
meeting.
you yep.
Yeah, yeah,
So yeah,
that was fun.
no, and I think like again, I think
Yeah,
this
but
goes back to the education component. I see this as very low cost advertising for me to start a conversation about what's biochar and
yeah,
how you can work with it. So it's a great way to represent. Yeah, and
yeah,
talk.
yeah. Well, I had a commercial um, pyrolyzer and distribution business. I used,
Right.
this is advertisement for me around town, buy the biochar. So yeah,
Yeah.
it does make sense. And I do know that at the academy, Clayton Draper was talking about how she used to have a biochar license plate, and then somebody
Yeah.
took it. Somebody
It
else
was
registered
me.
it,
I
and
know.
then it
I
was
felt
you.
so guilty about it for a while, but she's so supportive. I mean, she's a huge mentor to me, Kathleen, and especially on the material side because she's very interested in that side as well. So she's one of our advisors for Echo, and I speak with her once a month. So I know now she has Biochar One.
Wow.
I think she has the license plates.
Yeah, nice. Well, I know that she's writing a book, and it's all
Yes.
about the built environment. So my guess is that we're going to see your name in
Possibly,
there.
yeah. She sent, yeah, actually, I'm pretty sure because there's a chapter on insulation and she asked me to take a look at it. And there's a blurb about our work in there as well.
Yeah. Well, my understanding is this is going to publish soon, and we're going to have her on the Biochar Show with her own
Nice.
podcast episode. So I'm really looking forward to that. As we come to the end, what do you have anything we talked a little bit about the optimism. Do you have any kind of soapbox that then leads into your another
Another
take on
take on
optimism?
optimism. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
for me, I got into this because, yeah, I mean, I got into this because of my kids and, seeing the world that, we're careening towards them inheriting. And, I think sustainable furniture was a great career, but, it wasn't enough. And I think every day I'm able to make some biochar or tell someone about it, make that connection, I feel like it's a step forward towards, potential solution, and it's not going to happen, you know, next day. It's not going to happen next year, maybe, but it makes me feel, when I get the reception I get towards biochar and the work that I do, I always feel like, it's the right thing to do. And I think the whole, being part of this industry and being part of trying to find a solution to repair our soils, to, reduce carbon from the atmosphere and to make really cool products while we do it. I mean, that's pretty much the
Yeah.
dream right there.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Agree. Healthy food, healthy people. I know
yeah,
it's like, hey kids, I love you. What is it the kids do these days? I'm doing it wrong,
yeah,
but I love kids. Like, yeah, no,
yeah,
it's generational benefit. I mean, we're making stuff that literally can register as a blip on deep
yeah,
time.
yeah.
How cool is that? So, all right. So I want to point out to everybody, Bill, this has been a fantastic interview. I want to thank you so much. We will put in the show notes, there'll be information on how to reach out to Bill. Bill, do you want to tell us a couple
Yeah,
of contact
for
points for you real quick?
biochar on the production side, New York Carbon, NY Carbon, my email is bill at nycarbon.co. And then on the research and education, White Feather Farm, my email is bill at whitefeatherfarm.org. And either of those, you can reach out to me and I'm happy to talk biochar anytime.
Bill, I want to thank you for being part of the Biochar Show podcast sponsored by Biochar today. We look forward to discussing more about this thing called highly configurable carbon biochar for sequestration. Thanks again, Bill. It's fantastic to see you.
Oh, yeah.
Let's hold up our signs and say goodbye to
Thanks for having me,
everybody.
John. This was awesome.
All right, Bill. Yeah,
All
Bill,
right.
we'll catch you in the notes,
Peace.
man. This fantastic episode with Bill Hilgendorf reinforces a core truth about where this industry stands today. Biochar is not yet a fully defined market. It is a developing material class, a distributed production system, and increasingly a bridge between waste streams and high-value applications. What Bill is building through education networks, regional production, and material innovation points to a broader shift. The constraint is not just technology, it's understanding standards and the ability to connect production to real world use cases, from soil systems to stormwater, from carbon markets to building materials. The question is no longer whether biochar has a role. The question is how quickly can we align production and demand? If you want to continue this conversation, you can find Bill through NY Carbon. So Bill at nycarbon.co, Whitefeather Farm, Bill at whitefeatherfarm.org. As always, you can find more information, links, and supporting material in the show notes. This episode is part of the Biochar Show, produced in collaboration with Biochar Today, where we are working to bring clarity, structure, and momentum to a rapidly scaling industry. This conversation was fantastic, it was enjoyable, and it's absolutely worth sharing. Hit the buttons to subscribe to the show on your preferred platform and share it with others working in carbon, climate, agriculture, and the built environment. If you're working to source, deploy, or better understand biochar in real-world applications, connect with me on LinkedIn at John801 or gobiochar.com. I want to encourage you to keep up the important work out there. We can do this, and see you at our next conversation. The supporting sponsor of this program is Future Fresh Farms and their Micro-Revive biological product line. Biochar provides the carbon. Biology unlocks the potential. Micro-Revive introduces beneficial microbes designed to work alongside biochar, helping support nutrient retention, root growth, and resilient living soils, suitable for direct-to-soil, foliar, and controlled environment applications. Micro-Revive is OMRI certified and registered for agricultural use in all states. Micro-Revive, regenerating soils to feed the future. Learn more at futurefreshfarms.com. The biochar industry is growing fast. Connect with the people, projects, technologies, and ideas shaping its future at the North American Biochar Conference. Learn more, register, or become a sponsor at biocharconference.com.